Hallo und willkommen zurück zu Heavy Rain für die PlayStation 3. Ich bin der Recki. Wir gucken uns hier die Bonusvideos an, bevor es bald endlich mit dem Präparator losgeht. Die Premiere von Heavy Rain.
Hi, my name is David Cage. I'm the writer and director of Heavy Rain. Welcome to the launch event of Heavy Rain in Paris.
Very happy to be here in Paris. This sort of new generation of game warrants a big splash. It needs to be its story, it needs to be told.
That's really it, stepping in, because I'm not someone who was a gamer beforehand. The thing that really attracted me to this was the idea that they're selling it on how far will you go for someone you love.
What I love about it is there are choices all the way down, and you don't know what the consequence of those choices are going to be. And unfortunately, as the FBI guy, I killed a religious nut by mistake, and I'm still worrying about what that's going to do to me later in my life. I think I was reassured that because I had to do other things. I saved a woman who had slashed her wrist and was drowning or dying in the bathtub. And it took me ages to work out how you manipulate it, because the movements of the control thing aren't the normal violent ones. You have to develop a rhythm, and you bring her back to life.
It's not a game, it's not a video game per se, it's not a movie. It's something different. When I saw the actors here with the same expressions, they're the same thing. You're like, okay, they're not coming out of nowhere. They're actually people. You can feel the flesh, you can feel that there are emotions behind, there is blood pumping, and it's not just all digital. There is something, there is a soul behind.
A game usually asks you to do over and over without thinking, to learn a certain series of repetitive movement. Here, you're constantly forced to think about your choices.
It's great to share the pleasure of releasing this game with all the people who participated to the development, but also to journalists and to press and to gamers. So it's just about sharing tonight, really.
All the four main characters will be confronted in a way or another with this investigation, but also with this question: how far are you prepared to go to save someone you love? And each character will have to answer this in different ways, and all these different interlaced stories tell a bigger story.
The emotional journey is a series of intense challenges that make you question your moral position, your physical ability, but I think most of all it puts you in situations where there are exceptional circumstances and you don't know whether you're going to step up to be emotionally capable of following through.
For me, playing Madison was like playing any other role really, whether it was for TV, film or whatever. You kind of bring, you connect to the character and you are acting in that moment. So whether you're on stage or on a set or in a sports hall or wherever you may be, you're still bringing the same energy and the same inspiration to that.
Working in a game is kind of like really liberating. The motion capture technology is really fun to work with because it enables you're not waiting to do close-ups and different shots and stuff. You can do it all in one. So in many ways it kind of gives you that kind of theatrical flow, and then they can do whatever they want.
There's been an awful lot of people working on the project. We have our own studio with approximately 100 people, full-time employees, but we work with 90 actors. We had approximately 60 people overseas working with us. We outsourced in a very interesting fashion some of the graphics in the game, and we had also artists that came to the project, for a certain time to bring their expertise in certain fields, for the character creation, for the set creation. So all in all, we had approximately 220 people working on the game. So it's quite a massive production.
Where Heavy Rain tries to evoke empathy or sadness or joy, and really try to become an emotional roller coaster, make you go through very different types of emotions, and pleasure of playing comes also from what you feel.
So, weiter geht's mit der nicht linearen Story. Ich glaube, ab jetzt wird es ein bisschen interessanter. Ich muss sagen, ich kenne auch noch nicht alle Videos. Das eine oder andere hätte ich so weggedrückt. Aber für euch tue ich alles.
A story, by essence, is linear. And interactivity means giving you the possibility to go wherever you want and basically not follow the linearity of a story. What David and his team have invented is called bending stories.
We started to consider a story like a rubber band that the player could stretch or deform based on his actions. So the backbone of the story is always there. Whatever you do, it's your rubber band. But depending on what you do, you can stretch it or deform it. And so you create different stories, but keeping the backbone of the main stories.
And again, you have the choice. And that's the interesting thing, is that you get to play both options. That's definitely different, and that's quite unique.
The first example of non-linearity is in the Happy Birthday scene. It's based on the fact that the player's time is subject to a predefined timer. He can perform a large number of actions, but he does not have time to do them all. In this first scene, he has to make choices. Does he want to go to work, go outside, have fun? None of these choices have any consequences, but they familiarize the players with the basic principle of heavy rain. Nothing is really story-driven. Once he has integrated this logic, the player will encounter several scenes with increasingly important choices to be made. In the father and son scene, he can look after his son, or he can neglect him. Of course, these early choices will have consequences. This second example of non-linearity in the story is based on the role play. The player's behavior thus has consequences for the rest of the game.
How did things go at school today?
I was punished because I didn't do my homework.
I'm sorry about that, Sean. Next time, we'll really pull it together, okay?
And this is the third type of non-linearity. Scenes where the consequences are really important for what comes later. Thus, when Shelby encounters Lauren for the first time in Sleazy Place, he can succeed in getting very important information for the rest of the investigation.
What do you want to know?
Just as he can succeed in getting himself thrown out of the room without any information because of his rude behavior.
I bought 10 minutes of your time, didn't I?
Get the fuck out!
In the same way, when Lauren is attacked by Troy, does Shelby intervene, or does he leave them to it? These choices will naturally have consequences for Lauren. Later, in the supermarket, Shelby can prevent, by word or deed, the hold-up man from attacking Hassan, just as he can let poor Hassan get shot. This choice is of capital importance for what follows. If Hassan dies, Shelby will never get the box with the origami figures. As this never happens, there will be no reference to it in what follows. In the same way, Mad Jack can be arrested right away, rather than having a fight with him. Ethan can also decide to kill the dealer or to spare him. If the player decides to spare the dealer, he will not have the hangman letters corresponding to this trial. This will hamper his progress in his search for Sean.
Well, when you have an experience like Heavy Rain, really based on story, the game over status doesn't really mean anything in matter of storytelling. It doesn't really exist. So we try to find new ways of treating failures from the player. So, okay, you missed, your character failed or died, but the story goes on. It continues, it's just an information that the script takes on board.
There are many scenes where the heroes can die, which will influence the course of the game. If Madison is killed by the dock, she will never get to Shelby's apartment. Similarly, if Ethan is arrested by the police in the on the loose scene, he will not be able to get to the origami rat trial. Moreover, the final scene, the warehouse, can be played out in several different ways. Ethan can be alone, or be accompanied by Madison, or Jaden, or both. In the same way, Madison can be alone, or with Jaden, and vice versa. Finally, none of the heroes may manage to save Sean. All of this will have an effect on the epilogues. Heavy Rain is not a game in which, although there are several different possible routes and actions, there is only one ending. There are many endings that necessarily vary with the player's choices in the course of the adventure. These endings are a little like a window that gives us a glimpse of each character's future after the game. We can see them draw closer to each other or further apart. Some of them can become completely depressed, while others may recover a love of life. The endings are in the form of many little epilogue groups. This is why we can't speak of a determined number of endings. In reality, each character can end up in different ways. Each player will therefore see a unique combination of these multiple epilogues, depending on the choices he made with his characters, thus rendering his experience and the denouement of his story unique.
Krass, habt ihr gesehen? Die hält dem Origami-Killer da die Knarre an den Kopf. Ist ja interessant alles zu sehen, aber auch ein Haufen Arbeit, ne? Aber das Spiel hat einen sehr, sehr hohen Wiederspielwert. Das ist echt heftig. Heftig.
From the very beginning with Heavy Rain, we were looking for the kind of atmosphere you find in detective movies. Dark, cold, and disturbing, but also mysterious and fascinating. The artistic direction grew out of the Origami Killer's modus operandi, drowning in rainwater. Right from the start, rain appeared as the key to the story. It lends fatality to our tale, but also the feeling of an insurmountable force, the impression that we're fighting against elements that will continue on course whatever we do. Whatever happens, the rain will fill the tank, drowning the Origami Killer's victims little by little. Ethan will fight relentlessly against this fatality. Human misery and sadness are added to this irresistible and increasingly murderous power. The captured children all come from underprivileged backgrounds with nothing to fall back on. It was only logical to conjure up the great cities of the East Coast. The game is close to 7, and like it, it also needed a strongly typed urban environment. We retained Philadelphia. In the preparatory stages of Heavy Rain, some of the team went to spend a few weeks in Philadelphia with cameras and movie cameras, soaking up the strange atmosphere, particularly in the more run-down districts where the story would unfold.
Several elements impressed us. The kindness of the people, the violence of the city, the poverty, the barbed wire and the oil factories in the heart of the neighborhood. Without meaning to convey a message, the subtext of Heavy Rain also has something to say about this social aspect of America. The images we brought back from Philadelphia were very useful in rendering the background of Heavy Rain credible, but also in making its ambience more vivid and really giving it a meaning.
To translate these ideas, we decided to call in an artistic director from the movie world, Thierry Flamand. We were impressed by his work on the Crimson Rivers and gave him the difficult task of creating immense sets transformed by rain and misery. Most of all, we wanted to have a cinematographic point of view in our video game plot. The initial sketches resulted in more than 90 sets, almost all of which were retained in the course of the game. From the grim little motel room to the majestic highway in the rain and the run-down suburbs steeped in depression, the degree of perfection attained in these conveyed the background mood of Heavy Rain. The initial artistic concept resulted in a gigantic tableau in the form of the storyboard displayed in Quantic Dream's offices that drove the whole team and constantly confronted them with the main elements of Heavy Rain's plot. a disturbing story set against a background that is dank and squalid and majestic all at once. In fact, after the mall scene, we had to create a break by immediately introducing the real atmosphere of Heavy Rain. It was evoked in the opening credits, with everyday scenes, with characters in the foreground, and the omnipresent rain. This enabled us to highlight the city where the story unfolds as a powerful character. The idea of text placed in the set came from David Fincher's Panic Room. The credits scene is one of the most powerful scenes in the game, one that really lends it a unique color and ambiance. A rainy day, an element in itself. It becomes a player in the story in spite of itself, justifying the presence of the origami killer on the one hand, and the uneasy atmosphere that pervades the story on the other. It is a prime scenario element. It lends a dull color to this grim and sad story.
Ja, alles schön nochmal erklärt, ne? Damit ihr das auch ja versteht, was denn hier passiert ist. Ich hoffe, dass ich in diesem Part mit dem Bonus fertig werde.
Given that the story of Heavy Rain takes place in a very realistic universe, the action sequences had to be as realistic as possible. We did not want our characters to be supermen versed in the martial arts. Ethan is a family man and has no training in the martial arts. And although Madison is a sportswoman, she's no fighter. Jaden has received different types of training from the FBI, but he's really not an on-the-ground man. Shelby learned to fight in the street and proves to be a man of great brute force. When we had defined the profiles of the characters, we called in a stunt coordinator to work on the choreography. We called on Olivier Schneider, a stunt coordinator who is used to working for film and who already worked for us on our previous game. It all begins with a document describing the different action sequences in the game. And we get together in the mocap studio in a rudimentary version of the set in order to elaborate the final choreography. It is a real joint effort, with Olivier contributing his knowledge of different combat techniques and situations, and us contributing the constraints that are specific to video games. The main difficulty in the exercise is that for each blow in Heavy Rain, we had to allow for the possibility that the blow is successful or that it fails, while making sure the different options are compatible. This is also where we work out safety problems, positioning mattresses, protection for stuntmen, etc. When it comes to shooting the choreography, everything has been worked out. All the stuntmen have to do is give it all they can.
The action sequences in Heavy Rain were a great pleasure for the camera team to direct. The variety of situations, from car chases to close combat and gunfights, make it a pure pleasure for us movie lovers. These are very interesting sequences to film, and a game like Heavy Rain allows us to explore a whole range of situations, all of which are very different. In film, the sheer scope of things involved, from restricted budgets, prevention of accidents, and damage to sets, can place severe restrictions on actions. Once a scene has been filmed, it is rare to be able to reshoot it. Curiously enough, the advantage of video games lies in the non-spontaneity of the filming. The freedom offered by the real-time camera animation tool, which was specifically developed for this game, enables us to completely review the direction of a scene several months after it is shot. Nothing is fixed. We can explore new ideas and improve direction right up to the last minute. However, the constraints lie elsewhere. We must never lose sight of the fact that the player must not be a mere spectator during action sequences. Having spectacular action is not enough. The player must feel completely immersed in the experience. That means that we are often forced to make compromises in terms of framing and editing to ensure that the player always has the information needed to understand the action required. A real joint effort between the camera and the gameplay teams enables us to find the right balance between spectacular direction and the playability of the scene.
So, 2 Videos noch, dann haben wir es geschafft. So langsam muss das Coole kommen, was ich... Eins war richtig geil und das habe ich gesehen. Oder habe ich das nicht freigeschaltet?
We chose at the beginning of Heavy Rain to introduce the interface in a scene that all players are familiar with, waking up in the morning. The player comes to grips with the interface while performing everyday actions. As he discovers the controls, he interacts with his environment in the simplest way possible. Progressively, and without realizing it, he takes on the role of Ethan Mars in his everyday life. This scene, which seems to be extremely simple, took a very long time to put together. In the very first version, the house had only one floor, and the scene began directly at Ethan's drawing board, where the player learned the game controls.
Ja, das Video
Then
ist
it
das.
developed with the addition of an extra floor in order to introduce Ethan more progressively with the wake-up scene. The scene became a little sandpit where the player is free to choose what Ethan does. For example, whether he works at the drawing board or wanders into the garden while waiting for the family to come home. The scenes with the kids were obviously absolutely essential to the story.
That's it, I'm free as a bird.
We had to build up the relationship with the kids at all costs, establish this well-balanced and loving father in order to have the player really implicated in his father role later on. Playing with the kids, making them laugh, engaging in a sword fight with his son, all of these are taken from the life of all fathers and really get the player into his role as a father. All the motion capture animations of the kids were recorded with real 8 and 10-year-old kids, Taylor Gassman for Jason and Quentin Cage for Sean. The dead bird sequence closes the scene like a sort of omen.
What's up?
It's Merlin dead and it's all my fault.
No, it's not, Sean. Of course it's not your fault.
Sean is confronted with death for the first time. Ethan has to respond to his son's sadness.
There are some things which just have to happen, even if you don't want them to.
His response, which is one of resignation, is an admission of his own powerlessness when faced with death. It is a forerunner of what is to come. The mall scene is the central scene in Heavy Rain, the one where everything changes in a matter of seconds.
It was extremely important for me to have the player playing the scene and the first scene in Ethan's home. We could simply have shown the scenes in a cutscene, but the player would have not felt implicated in the same way. Playing a scene or merely watching it completely changes the player's relationship with the story and his identification with the character. So it was imperative for the player to experience these scenes with Ethan rather than just showing them. The player doesn't just know Ethan's history. He has lived it with him, he knows what he lost, and he feels the guilt.
The scene is really quite simple. The player loses his son first time, but quickly finds him again near the clown. When Jason disappears a second time, we change the animations for Ethan's movements to make him look more panicky. The calm camera at the beginning of the scene becomes a handheld camera. The music increases the pressure on the player. We used the same mechanisms as film to create the dramatic tension in a classic manner.
This sequence is the perfect example of what every sane video game developer avoids like the plague. It lasts about 5 minutes in all, but it took us almost 2 years to develop. Managing a crowd in which the player can move freely means managing around 1,000 passers-by at the same time. We had to use a lot of tricks to get around the technical constraints. To optimize the calculations, the game program masks all the passers-by that are not in sight, while continuing to simulate their movements and their animations. If the player turns his head very quickly, the paths of the crowd members remain consistent, even if they have not been displayed for a time.
Then, all that remains is to bring the camera closer in order to increase the agonizing impression of being with Ethan. Here again, classic movie directing.
The accident scene is one of the rare sequences that I storyboarded before filming it. It is quite a complex sequence with a lot of things happening at the same time. There is Ethan coming out of the mall, Jason who is lost, the car coming. By using 3 windows, we could tell these 3 stories at the same time and lend a particular style to this scene.
The player loses his son in this scene. Everything that happens is his fault. The aim of this scene was really to create a very powerful feeling of sadness, almost depression, a feeling that is rarely presented in such a tangible manner in interactive experiences.
This scene is one of my favorites in Heavy Rain. Everything depends on the relationship the player decides to have with his son. He can decide to play the responsible father who looks after his son and tries to reestablish bonds, Or he can be the father who is crushed by sadness and guilt and who prefers to turn in on himself. Both attitudes are consistent with the character, and it is the player's actions that dictate Ethan's attitude after the accident.
The depressing atmosphere in the house is based to a large degree on dynamic management of light and shadows in order to imitate fading light at the end of a fall afternoon. The sun goes down, the shadows lengthen, and the light begins to fade until it plunges the house in darkness. The scene requires management of the boy's behavior. Goes to the bathroom, gets himself something to eat, and falls asleep on the sofa. Whether he was a good father or a negligent father, the player is now bonded to his son because they have shared something together. This bond will build up the player's motivation to recover his son after he disappears. Through his choice of actions, the player contributes to building up the character and his motivation.
Nee, das war das doch nicht. Okay, eins haben wir noch. Dann haben wir es fertig. Dann müsste das gewesen sein. Mensch, ich hoffe, das war das, sonst muss ich das Video erst suchen. Das war das spannendste Video überhaupt, weil die Szenen gezeigt haben, die nicht vorkamen im Spiel. Vielleicht ist das auch ein Bonusinhalt. Ja, das ist es.
Anne Shepard's hospital room just after Madison. He hugged her in his arms and then smothered her with a pillow. We decided to exclude this very violent scene. A man who venerates the concept of the father to such a degree, and by extension the concept of the family, cannot kill his mother like that. And although we learn that Anne's son never visits her, it may have been too radical to envisage Shelby getting rid of his own mother, who is senile to boot, therefore incapable of remembering that he is there. By merely looking at his mother without talking to her, he again becomes the little boy who is desperately seeking a father worthy of the name in a world that has disappointed him. Initially, the idea was that when Ethan had his blackouts, he would find himself in a sort of nightmare, lost in the ruins of a house underwater. Ethan would swim without really knowing where to go, just following the corridors until he came upon the body of the child, the victim of the origami killer. He would then wake up, as in the final version, in Carnaby Square, with an origami figure in his hand. The first blackout takes place after Ethan puts his son Sean to bed. Once Sean is asleep, Ethan goes back downstairs, but when he reaches the bottom of the stairs, he sees water on the floor at the front door. He turns around and sees water coming down the stairs behind him. The water continues to rise. Looking out the windows, we realize that the water outside is already higher than the house. Ethan runs toward the front door of the house. When he gets there, the door literally explodes and an enormous quantity of water submerges Ethan. The second blackout, which is much more spectacular, happens when Ethan loses Sean in the park. The camera started to tremble more and more, and a tsunami suddenly submerged that whole part of the city. Then we found Ethan underwater, as in the previous blackout. Two similar elements for a paranormal explanation. Shelby was present at the time of Ethan's accident, and a special bond was forged between them. From then on, Ethan accessed Shelby's mind whenever he killed children, corresponding to the times when Ethan found himself in the house underwater, filled with Shelby's memories. The water is the metaphorical representation of the killer's mind. During his blackouts, Ethan goes to Carnaby Square, the place where Shelby's brother died, and he makes an origami figure at the same time as the killer makes one to leave in the hands of the victim. These scenes were not retained in the end because they made the story too complex and introduced a paranormal element that added nothing to the story. We decided to remove them a few months before the end of development, particularly in order to speed up the start of the game, recenter the narration, and anchor the story in reality. This scene shows us Ethan getting out of bed in the morning. He goes to wake up Sean to take him to school. The scene is redundant because of the father and son scene. However, this part of the game was not without interest. It placed the player in the role of a responsible father, looking after his son and himself. As he passes near the letterbox, Ethan notices the origami killer's letter that informs him that his son will soon disappear. Of course, it is a touching scene, but too close to the father and son and the birthday scene for it to have any real existence of its own. We therefore decided to include the letter in the father and son scene and to get rid of this scene.
Schon krass, was sie eigentlich vorhatten. Dass ihre Mutter tötet.
Journalist investigating the origami killer. In one of the first versions of the game design, Madison went to her newspaper office several times. At the American Tribune, she could conduct research to find possible suspects, speak with her boss, and write articles after her missions. In the same way, Madison's apartment was different in the beginning. It was in the process of being redecorated. One of the player's first tasks was to repaint and change the layout of the apartment in order to personalize it. This was an interesting characterization process for a character who still remains quite mysterious. We never learn in the game why Madison suffers from insomnia. In reality, it stems from her past. As a journalist, she was a war correspondent during the armed conflict in Iraq.
Ja, und damit vielen Dank fürs Zuschauen. In der nächsten Folge widmen wir uns der Zusatzkapitels der Präparator. Freut euch drauf und bis zum nächsten Mal. Ciao.